What I'm about to tell you was never meant to reach your ears. In 1857, a carpenter renovating a chapel wall in northern Wisconsin pried loose a stone and uncovered a cavity. Inside, a bundle of scorched papers, a rosary clutched in a skeletal hand, and a note written in Latin that read, "They buried us alive. Pray for us. The devil wears a habit." That chapel was part of St. Mary's Convent, and the nuns, 23 of them vanished without a trace. You weren't supposed to hear that. And yet, here you are. Most men spend their entire lives worshiping systems designed to blind them, but a few begin to sense it. That itch in the back of your skull. The feeling that history has two versions, the one you were taught and the one that was buried. What happened at St. Mary's is not folklore. It's not dramatized fiction. It's not a ghost story passed down in taverns. It's documented, hidden in old diocesan archives, sealed behind court orders, and protected by institutions whose power depends on one thing. You're not asking questions. But ask yourself this: how does a convent, run by women devoted to charity and piety, become the center of one of the most disturbing unsolved disappearances in American religious history? Why were the first reports dismissed as clerical errors? Why did Rome quietly reassign every surviving witness? And why, more than 160 years later, does the Vatican still deny that St. Mary's ever existed at all? Because the truth wasn't just dangerous. It was damning. You've heard stories about priests and scandal. But this was a controlled psychological ecosystem, a weaponized cloister, a place where faith became fear, obedience became silence, and innocence became expendable. And it didn't begin with one nun. It began with a system older than America itself, built on control, secrecy, and ritual sacrifice. As you descend into the story, I warn you, once you hear these truths, they will not leave you. This is not a tale for entertainment. It is a warning, and for some it will be a reckoning. Because what happened behind the limestone walls of St. Mary's wasn't just evil, it was engineered. You're ready to go further? Good. The descent begins now. They called her Mother Superior Catherine Murphy, but the name was just a mask. To the outside world, she was the ideal image of Catholic womanhood. Tall, austere, disciplined, a woman who had forsaken earthly pleasures to serve God. But within the stone walls of St. Mary's, she ruled not with faith but with fear. And it didn't happen overnight. When she arrived in 1854, she was praised for her organizational skills, her unshakable devotion, her holy authority. But that's how it always begins, with praise, with elevation, with the slow deification of control. It's important you understand this. Catherine Murphy was not a rogue agent. She was a vessel of something ancient, something that had used convents, monasteries, and institutions for centuries to test one thing: how far will obedience go before it breaks? The younger nuns admired her at first. She spoke of sacrifice as sacred, of silence as virtue, of suffering as communion with Christ. But then came the rules, the surveillance, the punishments, and the disappearances. It began with isolation. Any sister who questioned the schedule, the diet, the penances was quietly reassigned to reflection periods, days of silence, fasting, and prayer locked inside the old wine cellar, alone with Bible and a single candle. Some emerged quieter. Others did not speak again. Then came the confessions, private, whispered sessions behind heavy velvet curtains. Always between Mother Catherine and a single novice. She claimed it was to purify the soul. But within months, girls were turning on each other, reporting dreams, doubts, impure thoughts. It wasn't faith. It was behavioral conditioning. What Catherine was creating was not a convent. It was a closed psychological loop, a control system so total that even thoughts became dangerous. That's not religious discipline. That's ritual grooming. Now ask yourself, where did she learn it? Not from a school, not from the Bible, but from something older. She once told Sister Elizabeth, "The church forgets its ancient tools, but I have not. Discipline must come before grace." What were those tools? That's what we're about to uncover. Because the disappearances were not random. They followed a pattern. And once you see it, you'll realize St. Mary's was never about saving souls. It was about harvesting them. In the spring of 1856, Sister Teresa Donovan started keeping a hidden journal, scraps of parchment folded beneath her mattress, written in code. She wasn't the first to grow suspicious, but she was the first to try documenting it. Her entries, discovered more than a century later during a demolition of a nearby outbuilding, reveal a reality far darker than any church record admits. They don't speak of miracles or devotion. They speak of rituals, nocturnal gatherings, and one name repeated again and again in Latin, Domina Umbri, the Lady of Shadows. Sister Teresa described nights when the chapel bell would ring at 3:33 a.m., not for prayers, but for what Mother Catherine called a vigil of light. Only a select few were summoned. Always the same, Mother Catherine, Sister Margaret, and Sister Elizabeth. The doors to the east wing would be locked, the rest of the nuns forbidden from leaving their cots. But Teresa, brave, rebellious, once disobeyed. She wrote of slipping from her bed, creeping barefoot down the cold limestone hallway. She reached the chapel door, slightly ajar, and what she saw shattered her understanding of everything she had been taught. Candles arranged in a spiral, a veiled figure on her knees, chanting, not in Latin, but something older. And in the center, a child, a boy no older than 4, pale and unmoving, placed on the altar. She wrote, "They did not pray, they offered. Elizabeth held the child. Margaret anointed his brow with ash. And Catherine, she whispered into the dark. The shadows moved. They accepted him." Teresa fled that night, not from the convent, but from her innocence. She never told anyone, not directly, but from that day forward, her behavior changed. She stopped writing home. She stopped speaking freely. She took penances without protest, because she knew no one would believe her, and those who spoke disappeared. 3 weeks later, Sister Mary Collins, who'd been asking questions about the missing letters from Sister Agnes, was transferred. That's how they phrased it. Transferred. But there was no record, no train ticket, no goodbye. And that night, the chapel bell rang again. 3:33 a.m. You need to understand something now, something that few men ever grasp in time. When institutions become ancient, they stop worshiping gods. They become them. If you study the layout of St. Mary's today, what little remains, you'll notice something strange. The chapel faces due north, not east, as is tradition. The cornerstone bears no date. And the stained glass windows, since removed, were not biblical scenes, but geometric patterns. Spirals, labyrinths, an eye in a triangle. When investigators reopened the site in 1996, they found foundations that extended far deeper than expected, beneath the chapel for levels. Brickwork from the 1700s, and beneath that, stone that predates any known structure in Wisconsin, possibly even pre-Columbian. That's not a convent. That's a temple rebuilt. The church didn't establish St. Mary's on new ground. It planted itself on something older. And here's the part that should make your blood go cold. Mother Catherine knew. Records from St. Augustine's Convent in Boston, where she served before Wisconsin, show she spent 2 years in what was euphemistically called ecclesiastical retreat. The documents don't say where, only that it involved study in Rome and spiritual conditioning. But a Vatican seal on one letter, an insignia known only to the Congregatio Pro Doctrina Fidei, the former Inquisition, suggests this was no mere sabbatical. She wasn't being prepared for leadership. She was being initiated. The missing nuns? They weren't victims of incompetence. They were part of a ritual cycle, disappearing in perfect intervals, each roughly 111 days apart. That's not random. In occult numerology, 111 is a number of the opening gate, a numerical key used in ritual calendars tracing back to ancient Sumer and Egypt. Its purpose? Threshold contact, reaching what lies behind the veil. What Mother Catherine and her inner circle practiced was not Christianity. It was something older wearing Christianity like a mask. The habits, the rosaries, the crosses, tools of camouflage. And the institution that sent her, the Catholic Church, it never stopped her. never investigated. In fact, records show that every bishop who tried to question the disappearances was transferred, silenced, or declared mentally unfit. So now we ask, was St. Mary's a rogue whore? Or was it a sanctioned experiment? An experiment in mind control, in belief manipulation, in sacrifice. The difference between a convent and a cult? Only one of them tells you that silence is holy. And if you're still watching, still listening, then you feel it now. You weren't raised in a world of truth. You were raised in a system of design. By the summer of 1857, the psychological control inside St. Mary's had reached its apex. There were 17 nuns left. None spoke unless addressed. None ate until the final prayer was said. None slept without the door to their cell left open, unlocked, at Mother Catherine's insistence. It is so the Holy Spirit may pass freely among us, she said. But Sister Teresa knew better. It wasn't the Holy Spirit they were making room for, because that year something changed, not just in the air, but in the women themselves. Sisters began to report seeing things, shapes in the corridors, voices behind the walls, eyes watching from the trees. Hallucinations, the church would later say. Mass hysteria. But the reports matched too closely. The same phrases, the same hours, the same presence. One of the orphans, 6-year-old Joseph M., was found at the base of the chapel tower one morning, silent, eyes fixed upward. He could no longer speak. When Sister Elizabeth questioned him, he simply drew a spiral in the dirt with his finger, over and over, clockwise, unbroken. The next day, he vanished. The sisters were told he'd been adopted, but Sister Margaret never gave a name. No carriage came. No records were filed. And that night, the chapel bell rang. 3:33 a.m. It always came back to the bell. There's something you need to understand. Rituals aren't always robes and fire. Real rituals, dangerous ones, are repetition under obedience, the control of time, the fracturing of will. Catherine understood this. She once told Sister Teresa, "Obedience is the knife that opens a soul. The more it bleeds, the more we can pour God into it." But God was no longer present in that place. Not the one you were taught to believe in. The God of St. Mary's was a hungry one, an older one that took on whatever name gave it access. Christ, Mother, Light. What was actually being summoned wasn't divinity. It was authority unbound. Because when you strip a person of voice, of time, of certainty, they'll worship anything that offers structure, even their own destruction. By the autumn of that year, for more nuns had vanished. No bodies, no witnesses, no accountability. Just a convent running perfectly on schedule. In the world of the initiated, nothing is random. Names, numbers, dates, they aren't placeholders. They're keys. When Sister Teresa's journal was finally decoded, one detail stood out above all others. She wrote that on the night before each disappearance, Mother Catherine was assigned the same reading during Compline, Psalm 88. An odd choice. Not a psalm of comfort, not one of joy, but one of abandonment. Thou hast laid me in the lowest pit, in darkness, in the deeps. I am shut up and I cannot come forth. Why that verse? Why that night? Because Psalm 88 is the only psalm that ends in darkness. No resolution, no hope, just despair. It was a signal, a psychological softening, a precursor to removal. One nun even whispered, before vanishing, "He has turned his face from me." Understand this. The church has long mastered the architecture of control, guilt, confession, penance. But what happened at St. Mary's wasn't about salvation. It was a study in compliance through fear. And someone was watching. Buried deep in the Vatican secret archives is a letter, dated 1859, from Cardinal Bartolomeo Ruspoli to a member of the Jesuit order. It describes promising outcomes from the Wisconsin cloister site and recommends expanded experimentation in isolated female communities with minimal external oversight. Let that sink in. This wasn't just tolerated. It was documented. Rituals, isolation, psychic breakage, all under the guise of divine service. But why? Because institutions need more than doctrine to maintain control. They need models. St. Mary's wasn't a mistake. It was a prototype, a place to test how far belief could be pushed, how pain could be reframed as purification, how loyalty could be broken and reforged. What they learned there didn't die when the convent closed. It was replicated, scaled, injected into schools, orphanages, military chapels, even corporate culture. And here's the part that should make you look in the mirror. You recognize this pattern because you've lived it. You've obeyed without knowing why. You've silenced your instincts to survive. You've bowed to systems that promise light and deliver chains. It didn't start with you, but it can end with you. In November 1857, a traveling priest named Father Julian Weber arrived at St. Mary's, sent from the Archdiocese in Chicago to review the convent's practices. That's the official version. But according to recovered telegrams, Weber had been privately alarmed by the number of transfer requests coming from nuns connected to Mother Catherine's former assignments. 3 women, all formerly under her direction, had left religious life entirely. One was later institutionalized. Julian wasn't a radical. He was old school, German Jesuit, trained in moral theology. He believed in order, but not in terror. When he arrived at the convent, the atmosphere disturbed him immediately. No laughter from the children. No songs in the corridors. Nuns walked like wraiths, silent, cold, watching the floor. That night, he met with Mother Catherine. He wrote that her presence was intellectually impressive but spiritually void. Her eyes, pale as river stones, did not blink once during their 40-minute meeting. She answered every question with perfect decorum, recounted details from memory, even smiled. But Father Julian noticed something else. Her hands never unclasped, even as she poured tea, even as she gestured. One hand always gripped the other, white-knuckled, as if restraining something. After that meeting, he tried to speak privately with several nuns. None would meet his eyes. One, Sister Miriam, shook so violently she had to sit. She whispered only one sentence, "Don't ask about the well." The convent stone well sat behind the eastern wing, half covered by ivy and locked with rusted iron grate. Father Julian asked for access. Mother Catherine refused. "No one has drawn from it in years," she said. "It's unstable, a danger." But that night, at 3:33 a.m., Julian heard the bell. He rose, walked to the chapel, found the door ajar. Inside, no candles, no sisters, just a low humming sound coming from below the altar. He wrote in his journal. The floor vibrated like a breathing lung. Something beneath, something old. Father Julian left the next morning. Quietly, he submitted no report. Instead, he resigned his post 3 weeks later, disappeared into rural Bavaria, and never spoke of St. Mary's again. But one note was found in his Bible years later, handwritten and unsigned. She is not a woman. She is a gate. Let's talk about the well. Before the church acquired the property, before the lumber baron built his estate, that land was known to the Ojibwe people as Nibiwabagwan, the water that dreams. According to tribal oral tradition, the area was avoided, not cursed, but thin, as if the boundary between this world and another wore down there. They believed the well had always been there, older than the forest, older than the bones beneath it, and that it whispered. The early lumber crews laughed off the tales. But records show at least 5 workers went missing during initial construction. No bodies, no accidents, just gone. The company reported them as deserters. But the well was sealed. Not filled, sealed, covered with a capstone engraved with a symbol no one could translate. A circle of 9 interlocking lines, spiraling inward. When the church purchased the estate, the well was listed as a non-functional water source, but it was left intact. And shortly after Mother Catherine's arrival, it was unsealed. Sister Teresa's journal confirms this. She wrote, "On the 3rd week of Lent, Margaret and Elizabeth reopened the stone. I was told it was for cleaning, but the smell that rose from it was not of water. It was of rot, of heat, of something awake." From that point on, things accelerated. The chapel bell began tolling more frequently, always at 3:33 a.m. And Sister Margaret, once precise and logical, began keeping dried herbs and patterns around her sleeping cot. She burned strange roots during midnight prayers. Claimed they kept the veil from tearing. Sister Elizabeth stopped speaking altogether for several weeks. When she returned, her tone was flat. She no longer laughed with the orphans. She wore gloves even in the heat of summer and kept her hands hidden beneath her sleeves. And Catherine began calling herself by another name in private. Mater Tenebris, Mother of Shadows. To those outside the convent, the work continued. Orphans were fed. The sick were treated. Donations increased. On the surface, St. Mary's looked like a miracle of faith and order. But inside, it had become a cathedral of obedience. And obedience, once hallowed of soul, becomes something far more dangerous. It becomes devotion to the abyss. In the winter of 1858, the disappearances escalated. Not just the nuns, the children. 3 of the orphans vanished between January and March. Boys aged 5 to 7. No explanation. No record. When asked, Mother Catherine replied with the same phrase each time. They were called. Sister Teresa tried to intervene. She questioned Sister Elizabeth directly, demanding to know what had happened to little James, last seen playing near the Gardens. Elizabeth's face was blank, her voice robotic. He was given for the greater light. That night, Teresa found a new pennant scrawled on her chamber wall. Not in ink, but in ash. Witness in silence. What's worse, she obeyed. Because obedience, under psychological starvation, becomes addictive. It offers a warped safety. You begin to believe that submission is survival, that not knowing protects you. That's the final stage of institutional mind control, internal censorship, when the victim begins to erase their own thoughts before anyone else can. But not everyone went quiet. One nun, Sister Helena Byrne, 27, a transfer from St. Louis, began secretly writing letters to the Archbishop. Her final note, smuggled through a traveling merchant, was intercepted. She was removed that week. The other sisters were told she had succumbed to spiritual exhaustion and returned to Ireland. But Sister Mary saw her be led to the East Wing, saw her bound wrists, heard the muffled screams behind the infirmary door. She was never seen again. And still, the church remained silent. Because here's what they won't tell you in the pretty textbooks or the guided tours. The church is not one voice. It is 1,000 voices stacked in layers of denial. And some of those voices, they don't pray. They watch. Watch for women like Catherine. Not to stop them, but to learn from them, study them, protect them. Because she was effective. She created total loyalty in 20 women and erased half of them without a single inquiry. That's not failure. That's refined control. And when systems discover something that works, they don't destroy it. They institutionalize it. They canonize it. They export it. By the spring of 1858, St. Mary's no longer functioned as a convent. It functioned as a closed system of psychological collapse, wrapped in the cloth of righteousness. Prayers were no longer spoken aloud. Meals were taken in total silence. And the punishments became rituals. Sister Claire Monaghan, age 22, was caught humming an Irish lullaby while preparing linen in the infirmary. It wasn't defiance, just a moment of memory, of warmth. For that, she was sentenced to 3 nights in the crypt beneath the chapel. No light, no food, just scripture, read aloud through a vent by Mother Catherine, in reverse Latin. Claire emerged the 4th day, unable to speak. Her hands shook uncontrollably. She no longer responded to her name. And then she was gone. But no one asked, because silence had become virtue. Submission had become holy. And to question was to betray. Understand, this is not just abuse. It is programming. Catherine was not operating at random. She was following a structure, one eerily aligned with protocols used by military interrogation units a century later. Sleep disruption, rhythmic indoctrination, controlled food intake, physical isolation, forced confessions, disassociation. These are not religious techniques. These are tools of identity disintegration. The rituals, the 3:33 a.m. bell, those were symbols. But the real power was in repetition, in the breaking of the individual into something new. And here's what should disturb you most. The Vatican never condemned Catherine. They buried her in their archives, in sealed letters, in disappeared correspondences. And then they promoted the model. Records show that within 10 years, similar convents were founded in rural Illinois, New York, and Quebec, each with unexplained disappearances, forced silence, and miraculous levels of obedience. Same structure, same hierarchy, same silence. Because Catherine wasn't just a mother. She was a blueprint. And if you've ever worked a job, sat in a school, or lived in a family where your truth was punished, you felt the edge of that same system. They don't need chains anymore. They built their prisons in language. The final orphan vanished in May of 1858. Her name was Lily Ann Harper. Age 6, blonde curls, green eyes, had a habit of hiding bread rolls in her sleeves for the angels, she said. She was beloved by all. Even Mother Catherine would occasionally kneel beside her during Mass, whispering things the other sisters couldn't hear. Then one morning, her cot was empty. No warning, no explanation. The sisters gathered around her bed after prayers, a silent circle of confusion. Her doll still sat beside the pillow. Her shoes were tucked beneath the frame. And in the center of the mattress, a spiral drawn in ash. That evening, the 3:33 bell rang not once, but 3 times. The next day, Sister Teresa finally broke. She approached Mother Catherine during recreation hour, a rare moment when speech was allowed. Her voice was low but firm. "Where is Lily?" Mother Catherine said nothing, just looked at her, pale blue eyes unblinking. Then quietly, she replied, "She was chosen, as you were, as they will be." That night, Sister Teresa wasn't seen in the dormitory, or the chapel, or the kitchen. She wasn't missing, but she was gone. She returned 3 days later. Changed, hair cut short, eyes hollow, hands always folded at her chest. She no longer questioned. She no longer wrote. Her journal, where she recorded months of silent rebellion, was gone. Burned, most likely, or buried, and in her place stood something else. Not brainwashed, not broken, rewritten. You need to understand how this happens, because it still does. Today we call it behavioral correction, re-education, retraining, but it's the same process. The same mechanism used in convents, cults, corporations, prisons, political regimes. Strip identity, isolate emotion, reinforce ritual, insert a new belief, not through truth, but through fear of deviation. This is not a relic of history. It's a weaponized formula passed down through institutions masquerading as salvation. And once you've seen it, you'll recognize it everywhere. In the way you speak, only when spoken to. In how you apologize for simply being uncomfortable. In how you forget the names of your own dreams. Because St. Mary's was never just a place. It was a test of obedience. And the world decided it worked. When investigators finally returned to the site of St. Mary's in 1907, the building was in ruins. The east wing had collapsed in a fire whose origin was never confirmed. Only the chapel remained, half consumed by ivy, its bell still hanging, silent, rusted, unmoved. A group of church archivists and lay historians were permitted access under supervision. Officially, it was a structural review before demolition. Unofficially, they were searching for records. What they found wasn't a ledger. It was a room. Hidden beneath the infirmary, sealed behind 2 layers of brick, was a chamber none of the surviving architectural plans accounted for. No door, only a hatch. Inside, 8 identical chairs facing a single stone basin. The basin was dry, but stained. Each chair bore a carving, delicately etched in Latin, Domini Obedientia, Ladies of Obedience. Around the walls, the same symbol repeated, a spiral of 9 interlocking lines, the same one from the well capstone. It wasn't just decoration. It was an engine, a symbolic structure used in occult traditions, not for worship, but for containment. They had built a throne room, not for God, but for the idea of total submission. When the Vatican archivists were debriefed, only fragments of their notes were preserved. But one phrase appeared in all three surviving testimonies. She didn't command with words. She commanded with absence. What does that mean? It means Catherine, Mater Tenebris, understood the most effective form of control isn't fear, it's emptiness. You don't break a person by filling them with terror. You break them by removing meaning. Take away time. Take away identity. Take away God. And then offer yourself as the only thing left. That's how cults form. That's how institutions become sacred. And that's how people are led, step by obedient step, into their own erasure. You've seen versions of this. The job that asks for total dedication. The school that punishes questions. The church that says doubt is sin. These aren't accidents. They're iterations. Catherine didn't invent the system. She just proved how perfectly it could be executed. And the world has been copying her ever since. Most historical accounts will tell you the convent closed in 1862. That's not accurate. It fractured. By that year, only 7 nuns remained. Of the original 23, 11 were declared transferred. 5 were listed as deceased, and the remaining were simply erased from record. But those inside knew the truth. They didn't leave. They were taken. Not all at once, but piece by piece. Sister Margaret, the healer, the herbalist, the once compassionate, had changed the most. Her remedies became darker, stranger. She stopped using willow bark and began experimenting with sedatives derived from nightshade, monkshood, and unknown root extractions. One child, an orphan named Samuel, fell into a coma after a purification tonic. He never woke up, and when Sister Teresa asked why she continued using the mixture, Margaret replied, calmly, "It opens the door wider." It was around this time that the nuns' dreams began to synchronize. 7 sisters reported identical nightmares. Walking barefoot through a hallway with no end, walls pulsing like lungs, hearing the sound of the bell beneath the earth. Mother Catherine began preaching sermons at night. Not in the chapel, but in the garden, under full moon, surrounded by herbs arranged in concentric rings. She no longer quoted scripture. She recited phrases in a language that none of them recognized, but all of them felt. One nun, Sister Frances, described it in a surviving letter. She spoke the words and my teeth hurt. My gums bled. I wanted to kneel, and I didn't know why. There was no fear, only gravity. And that's when it becomes clear, this wasn't madness. It was ceremony. And Catherine wasn't a villain, in the cartoon sense. She was a practitioner of something older than the church, older than the texts. She had weaponized faith itself, not as a path to salvation, but as a tool of compliance. The altar became an operating table, and belief became anesthesia, because once a soul is silenced, it will accept any master. The church's final investigation of St. Mary's was performance. In 1862, after rising pressure from parishioners and rumors leaking into nearby Chicago, the diocese sent Monsignor Alphonse Duret to assess the convent's condition. What they expected was a quiet closure. What they found was something else entirely. Duret was a loyal man, a Vatican-trained fixer. He'd handled rogue priests, schismatic nuns, and heretical texts with silence and steel. But even he hesitated when he reached the east wing. The building was cold, not from weather, but from absence. Rooms once filled with prayer and teaching were empty, beds stripped, journals missing, the crucifixes removed. And in the corridor between the infirmary and the garden, Duret discovered a door that should not have been there. No hinges, no frame, just with nailed-over stone. The seal bore the same spiral, 9 interlocking lines. But this time, they weren't carved. They were branded. Duret ordered the boards removed. Behind them, a stairwell spiraling downward. He descended alone. What he found beneath the convent has never been fully disclosed. But 2 details survive, buried in Vatican memos. The walls were marked with prayer fragments written backward. At the base of the stairwell was a pool of liquid that would not reflect light. When Duret emerged, he said nothing. He ordered the convent decommissioned. The 7 remaining sisters were sent to distant, unconnected facilities. Mother Catherine was declared mentally unfit and removed from the order. No trial, no charges, just silence. But here's the fracture line they couldn't hide. Catherine didn't disappear. She was reassigned. A year later, she surfaced under a different name, Sister Judith L., working at a cloistered abbey in Quebec. Then again in 1865 at a correctional convent in New Orleans. Then again in 1872 at a Reformation school for girls in Pennsylvania. Each time, the same pattern. Silence, vanishing, unquestioned authority. She didn't retire. She multiplied because they realized something. She wasn't a threat to the church. She was proof it could survive anything, if it was feared enough. We must stop imagining this as just a horror story. It was a prototype. What happened at St. Mary's wasn't a haunting. It was a programmatic event, a trial run for systems of silence, obedience, and psychological subjugation, dressed in holy robes. Look closely at what Catherine did. She stripped names. She shattered personal bonds. She altered time with bells. She reinforced isolation with punishment disguised as penance. She didn't destroy her sisters. She reformatted them. And this exact structure was mirrored just 20 years later in the Magdalene laundries of Ireland, convents that turned thousands of women into unpaid laborers, where girls as young as 12 were confined for moral correction. They worked in silence, ate in silence, wept in silence, and no one intervened. Because once an institution wraps cruelty in the language of morality, it becomes untouchable. Ask yourself, how many other places have you seen this formula? Prisons with reform in their names. Schools that demand order over understanding. Churches that teach suffering as virtue, but never question the source of that suffering. They don't call it manipulation. They call it discipline. But here's what discipline becomes when it severs your will. A ritual of forgetting. The missing nuns of St. Mary's weren't erased by death. They were erased by transformation into something more useful, something more compliant, tools of the structure that devoured them. Even the children disappeared into this system. Not all were taken physically. Some stayed, grew up, became teachers, nurses, missionaries, carriers of the same doctrine that had emptied them, passing it on with smiles and hymns and hollowed-out eyes. Because this is how darkness survives, not with monsters and shadows, but with inheritance. Obedience, passed like a gene. Repression, taught as love. And silence, enforced as virtue. This is not about the past. It's about recognizing when you were told not to speak, when your questions were met with punishment, when submission was rewarded and resistance was pathologized. Comment below the phrase, "I was taught to kneel, now I stand." Write it twice. Once for the part of you they tried to break, and once for the part that refused to die. After the official closure of St. Mary's in 1862, a strange thing happened. The Vatican didn't issue condemnations. They sent architects. 3 of them, to be exact, Father Benedetto Ruvo, Sister Laurentia Bell, and a Jesuit scholar known only as JCL. They weren't sent to mourn what had happened. They were sent to replicate it. A letter found in the Jesuit archives decades later confirms this. The structure at Lake Michigan reveals promising results in enforced virtue, spiritual purification, and suppression of heretical impulse. Recommend dissemination of method with regional adaptations. Dissemination of method, not investigation, not remorse. They treated it like a prototype, a psychological apparatus that could be retooled for other purposes. Obedient schools, moral correction houses, and most disturbingly, reformation centers for wayward girls. Between 1865 and 1900, over 200 such facilities were built across North America, the UK, and Europe. Most were run by religious orders, and many bore architectural similarities to St. Mary's. Bell towers, always 1, 3 wings, always 3, basement chambers, unlisted on public blueprints. It wasn't coincidence. It was design. But the physical structures were just the beginning. The real power was in the ritual architecture. Waking before dawn. Silence during meals. Repetitive prayer cycles. Confessions extracted through deprivation. They called it sanctification. But it was identity erasure. And when these girls were released or discarded, they didn't return to society as themselves. They returned as mirrors for the system, reinforcing it in their children. their churches, their classrooms, not out of malice, but because it was all they'd been allowed to remember. That's how generational control works. You don't need soldiers. You need the broken, trained to speak softly and obey. St. Mary's wasn't shut down because it failed. It was sealed off because it succeeded too well. And the method had already moved on. The church didn't lose control. They refined it. And now, pieces of that model sit in places you wouldn't suspect. In the discipline policies of your child's school. In the HR code of conduct you sign but never read. In the way you lower your voice in the presence of authority without knowing why. Because Catherine's real legacy was building a machine that could run without her. In 1911, nearly 50 years after the last bell rang at St. Mary's, a construction crew arrived to begin demolition. The remaining structure had become a local legend, a haunted convent that children dared each other to approach. But what the workers discovered beneath the rubble was no ghost story. It was a burial field, not marked, not blessed, not even recorded. They found 14 shallow graves in a collapsed section behind the east wing garden. No headstones, just decayed cloth, fragment of rosaries, and skeletal remains. All female, all young. The church's response? Immediate. The site was declared sacred ground and sealed. A wooden cross was erected. A press release called it a tragic burial site from a flu outbreak. No mention of disappearances. No mention of the spiral carved into the tree beside the graves. But the workers had seen it. So had the foreman. So had the man who came that night with a sealed envelope and a warning. You didn't see what you saw. Take the money. Burn the notes. 2 refused. One of them, Thomas Garrick, 42, disappeared a week later. His journal would surface in 1978 in a private estate sale. In it, he wrote, there were no coffins, just fabric, and they were bound, arms across chest, ankles tied. Some were small. One had a name stitched in the hem, A. O'Connor. That matches parish records. Agnes O'Connor, the first nun to vanish. So now we know they weren't transferred. They weren't promoted. They weren't sent to other missions. They were buried. And the institution that buried them survived, still giving sermons, still collecting tithes, still preaching salvation through silence. Because here's the most chilling truth. The church never denied what happened. They reframed it, turned Catherine into a cautionary tale, made her a warning about unchecked female authority, about the dangers of mysticism, about the need for proper hierarchy. But never once, never, did they call her a murderer, because she wasn't just a rogue nun. She was the end result of a structure that rewards obedience without conscience. And in systems like that, the truly dangerous aren't the ones who disobey. They're the ones who obey too well. If you were raised inside any system that demanded obedience as virtue, you've already walked the halls of St. Mary's. You don't need a bell tower or Latin chants to know what it feels like to question yourself every time you speak. Because that's what Catherine perfected. Not just silence, but internalized surveillance. The spiral wasn't just carved into doors and walls. It was carved into minds. You don't need guards if people become their own jailers. Ask yourself, have you ever apologized for being in pain? Have you ever edited your truth to avoid conflict? Have you ever swallowed your voice, not because it was wrong, but because someone might disapprove? These are the modern sacraments of system that began long before you were born. What Catherine discovered was this. You don't have to torture people into submission. You just have to make their desire to belong stronger than their desire to be free. It starts with small rituals. Obey without context. Confess without evidence. Suffer without question. And if you repeat them long enough, they become personality. By the time they buried those 14 women behind the garden, the process was complete. They weren't victims of violence in the traditional sense. They were sacrifices to a structure, an altar made not of stone, but of rules, of uniforms, of unquestioned procedures. And here's the most terrifying part. You don't need religion for this. Governments do it. Corporations do it. Families do it. Any system that values order above truth is just a convent by another name. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because the walls weren't just built around the sisters. They were built around you. But the spiral works both ways. It can be a prison, or it can be a map. Because when you reverse the spiral, when you trace it outward instead of inward, you start to remember who you were before the silence. There's a reason stories like this are buried. Not because they're too horrific, but because they're too familiar. You see, horror becomes tolerable when we convince ourselves it's rare. But what happened at St. Mary's wasn't an outlier. It was a revelation of method. And once you understand that method, you'll see how it repeats. Under new names, with new uniforms, but the same intent. Control wrapped in virtue. Let's strip the veil. At the core of every system like St. Mary's, there are 5 pillars. Isolation. Cut people off from outside influence. Family, friends, letters, dissenting voices. Gone. Ritual. Repetition of behavior dulls the questioning mind. Chores, prayers, schedules. Not to enlighten, but to exhaust. Shame. Make people feel wrong for their very instincts. Replace I feel with I sin. Hierarchy. Obedience flows upward. Accountability never flows down. Erasure. Take their name, their story, their past, and rewrite it for them. This wasn't just spiritual. It was systematic conditioning. And now you're probably asking, if the church saw this happening, if records existed, if survivors whispered their truths behind closed doors, why didn't they stop it? Because stopping it would mean dismantling a tool that worked, not for God, but for them, obedient believers, silent women, empty bodies filled with doctrine. And when those bodies disappeared, no headlines, just footnotes, just words like transferred or fell ill. It's the same language institutions still use today when people vanish under their watch. They moved on. It was a personal matter. Let's not dwell on the past. But the spiral remembers. It marks every disappearance. Every young girl who asked why, and was told, because that's the rule. Every man who sensed something was wrong and stayed silent to keep his job. Every soul who kneeled to survive and never stood up again. You are surrounded by those spirals. Some are still spinning, and some, if you're listening closely, are beginning to unwind. To understand how this darkness spread, you have to stop thinking of it as religious. You have to think of it as strategic. Catherine Murphy, Mother Superior of St. Mary's, was not just a woman of faith. She was a survivalist. She understood something most never dare admit, that purity is power's favorite disguise. When she stripped away comfort, it wasn't cruelty. It was refinement. She wasn't breaking her sisters. She was tempering them, like blades. Because deep beneath the doctrine, beneath the ritual and prayer and incense, she wasn't worshiping the church. She was becoming it. The voice, the rule, the altar and the knife. And those around her, young, hopeful, far from home, mistook this possession by institution as devotion to God. That's how control systems work. They mimic love. They speak in gentle tones. They offer certainty. They relieve you of the burden of your own will. And then they drain you of memory, of instinct, of defiance. And you start to smile through the emptiness because no one ever told you that obedience can feel so much like peace, right up until the moment you disappear. It wasn't just the nuns who vanished. It was their ability to say no, to speak up, to remember who they were before robes and prayers and rules became their only language. And this is where the story becomes yours. Because if you've ever stayed silent when your soul screamed, something is wrong. If you've ever surrendered truth to avoid punishment. If you've ever bowed to something you didn't believe in just to survive. You were there, in spirit, in pattern, in the silence that swallowed 23 women and still echoes in every institution that profits from your obedience. But listen closely. Beneath the spiral, beneath the soil, there's a hum. It's not a prayer. It's the sound of memory returning. And once you hear it, you can't unhear it. In 1994, a seal box was discovered in the private archives of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. It was mislabeled as parish stationery. Inside were 46 handwritten pages. No official church markings. No author signature. But every historian agrees. The handwriting matches earlier letters by Sister Teresa Donovan, the farm-strong nun who dared question Mother Catherine. These weren't letters. They were a confession and a map. In them, Sister Teresa reveals what she witnessed in the final days of St. Mary's. I no longer believe she served God. I believe she served the structure that wore God's face. She said to us, if you make yourself empty, you'll be filled with grace. But what came into that emptiness was not grace. It was command, and it whispered to her at night, and she whispered back. She describes a ritual garden, the private cleansing room in the basement, and something she called the ceremony of the fifth veil. But the most terrifying passage comes near the end. She told us the church doesn't need to hide power. It only needs to get the right costume, the robe, the collar, the law, the brand. And if the ritual is done correctly, people will kneel, even if they don't believe. That is a psychological warfare Catherine mastered. It's not about creating belief. It's about creating submission in the absence of belief. The body kneels, the voice repeats, the soul vanishes, and those who resist, they don't fight back. They simply disappear, first from public record, then from memory, then from themselves. But Teresa's final sentence, that's the one that breaks something open. If this letter is found, I ask only one thing. When you see a child kneeling, ask them why. And if they say, because I was told to, stand them up. That's not history. That's instruction. And it's aimed at you right now. Because every day, somewhere near you, someone is teaching the next Catherine. And every day, somewhere near you, another Agnes is beginning to fade. And the only question left is, which one are you? There's a final detail most won't see, because it's not written in any record. It's designed into the silence itself. When the Vatican quietly closed a file on St. Mary's, they didn't just bury the names of the missing nuns. They codified what happened there. They converted a failure into a formula, and they pass it on, not through whispers, but through policy. In 1923, an internal Vatican document circulated to select bishops and monastic leaders. It was titled, On the Cultivation of Order in Cloistered Environments. It never mentioned St. Mary's, but it outlined verbatim every tactic used there: restricted speech schedules, sleep disruption as sanctification, surveillance disguised as spiritual oversight, emotional isolation framed as sacred retreat, physical discipline renamed acts of contrition, and in the final paragraph, a line that should terrify anyone who's ever questioned authority. The fruit of true obedience is the death of self. Only then can the vessel be filled by God or his designated authority. That's the crack in the armor. That's where we see it clearly. This was never about divinity. It was about replacement. Not replacing evil with good, but replacing your own will with theirs. Because once obedience becomes automatic, it doesn't matter who wears the robes. God, a CO, a colonel, a politician. They all become the voice in your head. The one that says, don't ask that. Don't speak yet. Stay small. Kneel now. That's how St. Mary survives. Not in ruins, not in records, but in the voices we've let live inside us for too long. Voices that sound like reason, but are actually the echoes of command. And here's the thing they never expected, that you'd hear those echoes and trace them back to their source, that you'd stand in the ruins of St. Mary's, not as a believer, but as a witness, and that you'd see the spiral, not as a symbol of damnation, but as a door, one that doesn't lock you in, but leads you out. If you've stayed with me this far, it means one thing: you've begun to remember. Not the events, those belong to the nuns, but the pattern, the feeling of something behind the veil, of rules that don't serve truth, of rituals that don't honor life, of voices that say obey when your soul screams run. You've begun to realize the convent was never just a building. It was a mirror. And when you stare into it, what do you see? A young woman on cold stone, whispering prayers she doesn't believe. A teacher repeating doctrines he never questioned. A man in a suit enforcing rules that were passed to him, not chosen by him. Or maybe you see yourself in the moment you almost disappeared, the moment you swallowed your voice because it was easier, because it was safer, because the structure told you to. And now that you remember, what do? Because memory is enough. They survive on our amnesia, our endless forgetting, our willingness to write it off as the past. But what happened at St. Mary's wasn't the past. It was a technology of control, one designed to upgrade itself. And now it's digital, algorithmic, invisible. They don't need stone walls anymore. They have systems. They don't need confessionals. They have data. And they don't need Mother Catherine. They have you. So you must choose. Do you become another voice in the machine? Another obedient transmitter of silence? Another vessel for the spiral to keep spinning? Or do you become what they fear most? Someone who remembers and speaks. Someone who sees the pattern and interrupts it. Someone who turns to the person next to them, still kneeling, and says, "Stand up," because in the end, that's all it takes to shatter the system. One person who stands. One person who sees. One person who says, "No more spirals. No more silence." And means it. The convent is gone. The bell tower collapsed. The garden overgrown. The limestone walls reclaimed by moss, by roots, by the quiet ache of time. But if you think the story ends in ruin, you haven't been listening. Because ruins don't destroy systems. Memory does. And now you carry that memory. You know that 23 women vanished not by accident, but by design. You've seen the blueprint of control, disguised as purity. You've heard the whispers from behind the veil, the ones that say, "Obedience is holy," the ones that say, "Pain is penance," the ones that say, "Your silence is salvation." And now you know, those weren't the voices of God. They were the voices of power. The same voices that echo through modern temples. Corporate offices where speaking truth risks your career. Courtrooms where justice bends beneath influence. Schools where curiosity is treated as defiance. Pulpits where fear wears robes and speaks in scripture. But now something dangerous is happening. You're remembering who you are. You're hearing the spiral unwind. And I want you to do something right now, not for the algorithm, not for vanity, but as a ritual of awakening. Comment below the phrase, "I break the spiral." I break the spiral. Say it twice. Once for them, the voices that never got to speak. And once for you, the one who still can. Because when enough of us say it, it becomes more than words. It becomes resistance. It becomes signal. It becomes a thing they've spent centuries trying to suppress. A man who remembers. A man who wakes up. A man who refuses to kneel. The spiral ends here, not in fear, not in fire, but in the return of the voice. Yours. Thank you for walking this path with me. If this story lit something in you, if it stirred that deep, wordless sense that something has been wrong for a very long time, then you're ready for more. Subscribe. Remember. Speak. Because the next story is already waiting. And they don't want you to hear it, but we're going to tell it anyway.